extra historians. Welcome to Lies, the part of the show where we tell you all the stuff we left out, all the things we got wrong, and all of the leveraged buys we short sold. I'm Rob. I'm the head writer of Extra History, and today we're talking about the Tulipmania, which I'm so excited to talk about. Thank you for voting for this series. I love that we got to do another weird and wonky economics series, especially one that is so heavily misunderstood, including by me when I started this. First of all, I just wanted to say Lies is made possible by Patreon. Thank you so much to our patrons. I say it every time because it's true. Lies is a really important part of the show, not just to keep us honest and point out the fact that we make mistakes, but also to tell you just our, in general, editorial notes and thoughts and the decisions we went through when making this series. I think that's not only good for us, but it's useful to someone who might want to try and make their own series or is getting into this. And it makes history a conversation, which it always should be. Recommended reading for this series is Tulipmania, Money, Honor, and Knowledge in the Dutch Golden Age by Godgar. No surprise we mentioned her, I think 3 or 4 times in the course of this series. Her recent work has been really important to understanding and recontextualizing the Tulipmania. So the book is very extensive. It's quite long, and it marshals a lot of evidence. It's a fantastic piece of work. It's not necessarily like easy beach reading, but not every good historical book is. It's fantastic. Thank you so much, if you're watching, for expanding our knowledge of this topic. Next one is Tulipomania, the story of the world's most coveted flower and the extraordinary passions it aroused by MacKay. This is a more readable kind of public history treatment of it. It does engage in some of the myth building that Goldgar has since tried to break down, but it's still a very cool, interesting book. Just FYI, we use the term Tulipmania, but sometimes Tulipomania is used and was used at the time. We just went with one over the other to keep it consistent. Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles MacKay. As we mentioned in our series, this book is kind of a trash fire. It's very much like Victorian tabloid history and just totally makes stuff up. It was still kind of an important book for me when I was getting interested in history academically. It's very readable. It's really fun. It still influences kind of how I see history because I read it at a really crucial time in high school during my development of understanding history. And the idea that beliefs that are not necessarily true can be a huge motivator for big events. Having said that, I wouldn't say don't read it, but it's probably a better lens in looking at how Victorians saw the past than it is in actually understanding the events that take place in it. But it's a very entertaining read to this day. There's a reason it has stayed in print. The Embarrassment of Riches, an Interpretation of Dutch Culture in the Golden Age by Schama. This isn't exclusively about Tulipmania, but it mentions it a bunch of times and talks about a lot of the cultural reasons that people liked tulips and seashells. I have a seashell here. By the way, I was unable to get tulips. There just aren't any to be had in Hong Kong right now. The season where they're getting shipped here passed by. When we were proofing the episodes visually, they were everywhere in grocery stores and florists, and you just can't get them right now. So I have an orchid instead, and some other stuff you might find in a cabinet of curiosities, like a quartz crystal and a seashell. If you want to learn more about this topic, we are sponsored by CuriosityStream and partners with Nebula. CuriosityStream has a wide range of documentaries on historical topics, including one on the tulip bubble, called The Tulip Bubble, and another called The $1 Billion Flower Market, which is a British documentary comparing the British cut flower industry to the Dutch cut flower industry, and kind of this David and Goliath story. If you don't know, the Netherlands is the world's #1 producer of commercial cut flowers, and one of the numbers they give in this documentary is that the Netherlands at times produces 200,000 cut flowers per hour. So it's just a huge industry, as we talked about in episode 5. One general question from YouTube. I hope that at some point in this series you can touch on the special tulip relationship between Canada and the Netherlands. After Canada liberated the Netherlands from Nazi Germany in World War II, the Dutch sent over special red and white tulips as a thank you, and have continued to do so every year since then. This is such a cool story. I did not come across that, so thank you for telling me that. That's very cool. So the Netherlands sends Canada tulips for World War II, and Canada sends Portland, Maine, a Christmas tree for helping after the Halifax explosion. So that's a cool little chain of gifting. Episode 1, YouTube question. We had multiple commentators. I did not know this was going to happen. Multiple commentators who claimed to have accidentally eaten tulip bulbs thinking they were wild onions and talked about those experiences. One of them was, I suspected the story about the sailor was false because when I was little, I tried to eat a tulip bulb thinking it was an onion, and after one bite, I realized my mistake. They're apparently very bitter. Another guy said, funny story, I once ate a wild tulip thinking it was a wild onion. I know that man wasn't just regretting the price tag a few hours later. Yeah, one of many reasons the story is considered false is there is no way to eat a tulip bulb and think it is an onion and continue eating it. What the second commenter was referring to is that tulip bulbs are also poisonous. They're not going to kill you, but they're going to cause some severe gastrointestinal upset. And they were eaten sometimes, or people tried eating them during major famines. In World War II, this happened. But it's really like a worst case scenario, like I cannot eat anything else kind of thing, because it's going to cause some pretty bad GI symptoms. We had a great comment that I'm so glad came in. As a Dutchman qualified in history, I have to say this video is very wrong about the Dutch Republic obtaining its wealth from the VOC. That's the Dutch East India Company. In fact, the VOC wasn't very significant until the 18th century. What made the Dutch Republic such an economic powerhouse was the trade with the Baltic. The wheat trade was still by far the largest in Europe, and the Dutch economic system, which was way ahead of its time, was especially prevalent in trade with the Baltic, not with the East Indies. It's a very common misconception, but I feel like this is important enough to point out as it disproves a lot of points about the 17th century trading being all about spices. Yeah, so a lot of information that we go through in the first episode kind of comes under the umbrella of us telling the myth rather than the reality. And this is one of those things that kind of plays into that. We had a larger description of the Baltic trade in episode 3. We talk about grain imports, but we don't really tie them to like the larger Baltic trade and particularly wheat and lumber. We had a couple of paragraphs about that, but they got cut for length. We have to really specifically make sure each episode script comes at a specific word length, and sometimes things get cut out of that. Often I talk about them in lies as a result, whether people bring them up or not. But basically, the reason that the Netherlands could afford so much of its population being artisans and business people in trading is because it doesn't have a large part of its population taken up growing food. They trade for it. And they're involved in the Baltic grain trade, the Baltic wood and lumber trade, and it frees up a lot of workers for other industries. And yes, this is a large reason why the Netherlands got so rich before a lot of returns came in with the East India Company or the West India Company in the Caribbean, which often also gets forgotten. Episode 2, patron question from Bjorn de Echt. I'm sorry, I apologize if that's, I looked it up, I thought that was the pronunciation. The use of expensive gardens with exotic greenery isn't exclusively from Tulipmania. I've visited a couple of older castles and mansions here in the Netherlands. Some of the castles have been in constant use as housing for more than 700 years, and it's a staple to see a couple of trees in the gardens that aren't local, sometimes not even European. It was prestigious to have a tree from as far away as possible, and do note that these were not trees that were planted as seeds, but trees that were dug up, roots and all, then transported to be replanted. I have no idea how big these trees would have been when they were shipped. Probably quite small when I've come across this. So my speculation would be that in a time of greater wealth, tulips could be an extension of this practice, especially when the wealthy were more urban and living in cities. You didn't easily have the room for these large trees, but if everyone knows how expensive this flower is, who needs a tree? This is a great expansion, and he's totally right about this. Gardening and the development of cultivated gardens was a thing, particularly among European aristocracy, long before Tulipmania. You have Tudor gardens and things like that. There are a couple of differences, and of course, trees and kind of transplanting trees continues to go on. We talk about it a little bit in the history of coffee, actually, where we talk about these royal botanical gardens that have samples from all around the world. And even in our series on Brazil, right, one of the things that they do is they create a royal botanical garden in Rio. And this is like a big state building thing. And that's part of what Carolus Clusius is doing, right, in the Tulip Mania series. He's helping create these botanical gardens which do have these exotic samples from around the world. But yes, he's totally right about this. This is a long-established practice before Tulip Mania. One thing that's different is that Tulip Mania is like small scale, it's individuals, but also Tulip Mania starts to really get into the botanical and scientific aspects of cultivation, on hybridization, and changing these. Often when you have these trees that are transplanted, often they're diplomatic gifts too, these trees, including into the modern era, right? One of the things that happens right after the attack on Pearl Harbor is that people in Washington, D.C. go and they cut down these cherry blossom trees that were given to the U.S. by Japan, which is very sad. And, you know, to this day, during the Trump administration, France sent a couple of trees from the battlefield at Belleau Wood to be planted on White House grounds. So this still goes on, this transplanting of trees as gifts. But this scientific aspect, this individualistic kind of like hobby scientific aspect of it is fairly new. YouTube question about Adrian Powell and his mirrors. I want to know how much these mirrors cost. It wasn't exactly a cheap trick back then. Given the time period, there was probably a lot more silver behind the glass, and silver wasn't cheap. Yeah, it's probably very expensive. You could probably repurpose these mirrors from somewhere else in the house. I have doubts about this story for what it's worth. Not as much doubts as I have for the ones that I just say like, nah, that didn't happen. I sometimes, when I look at this, I wonder if this is something he did for like a garden party or only at certain times of year where they weren't going to get wet or damaged. I'm like 70 to 80% convinced that this mirror box showing a bed of tulips, like multiplying the size of a bed of tulips, is a real thing. Having said that, a lot of people who own things like cabinets of curiosities were very interested in optics. One of the reasons that they have lots of crystals is they do start realizing, like, I can hold this in a beam of sunlight and it, you know, sprays out a spectrum of colors, and that's really interesting, and isn't this curious? So people are really interested in optics and optical illusions and things like that at this period. So it does seem like something a rich guy in the 17th century would do. I don't know if he necessarily did it all year. Maybe if he had a really important guest, he's like, bring out the mirror box, you know. So I don't know, but he was very, very wealthy. So it's interesting, someone commented, that the rise of popularity for tulips in both the Ottoman Empire and the Netherlands was influenced by religious prescriptions and taboos that restricted how rich people could show off their wealth. It's a really interesting observation. And in both, it's permitted because the tulip is seen as a work of God and not created by humans. Something that I think is really fascinating is it kind of marries this divine appreciation for divine creation with scientific experimentation and creation, right? So you're not just admiring this tulip because it's the work of the divine, but you're also using it to hybridize with another tulip and create a new tulip. So there's sort of like divine creation and scientific creation being married in this hobby, which I think is super interesting. And of course, Ottomans are no slouch when it comes to science too, so they're also approaching it in a scientific manner as well when they're gardening with tulips. A bunch of people got the Easter egg of Trazen the Infinite being in the Cabinet of Curiosities. So for those who are not familiar with Warhammer 40,000, Trazen is an immortal alien android who has decided he's the overlord of a planet, and he's decided he's going to use his immortality to create a giant gallery of everything he possibly can. He's kind of like the P.T. Barnum of the cosmos, or / the British Museum. So he goes stealing things and people in little holographic light prisons and displaying them as if they're part of a big museum. And so it's funny for him to be in a Cabinet of Curiosities. So it's Trazen trapped in a museum. And if you didn't know, one of the reasons that we did this joke is that I write Trazen for the Black Library. So it's a little bit of like a meta joke and a meta joke. It's crazy to think that tulips still hold their power over people to this day. Many of our farmers have to fend off tourists wanting to take pictures in the fields because of the damage it's caused. Yeah, in episode 5, we talk a little bit about, like, tulips do have this weird kind of attractive quality that is still around to this day. Instagram, like, if you search, there are news articles about how Instagram has really badly impacted the tulip fields because people just keep walking into tulip fields in the Netherlands to take Instagram photos and kind of end up getting chased off by tulip growers. One thing I also just want to point out is we talk a lot about like flower prices. Cut flowers are just expensive. Like if you've ever had to, get flowers for a wedding or even just go buy, a dozen roses for Valentine's Day or an anniversary or something like that, you're going to spend on them. Like it's not that unusual to spend $100 on a dozen tulips. That might even be kind of a good price depending on when in the year you're buying them and where you are. Episode 3, we said this is probably the biggest mistake of the series, and it's entirely my fault. We said that this practice of taking out a loan and putting just a little bit down on several tulip contracts was short selling, and in reality it's buying on the margin. This is actually a two-part mistake. So I made a terminology mistake on one part. My intention was to say that taking out capital for a loan that you can't cover and thinking that the asset you're buying is going to inflate in price enough that you can sell it and pay off the loan is short selling. That's not short selling. That is leveraged buy. And what was originally a second sentence, we talked about like buying on the margin, like putting a little bit down on a bunch of different stuff, a bunch of different tulips that you don't have the money to cover. So these were two separate things that ended up getting combined during editing, and I used the wrong term in the first place because there's a reason I don't handle my own retirement accounts myself because I'm not good at it. So I apologize. It was quite a big mistake. I was looking at a different part of one of the source books, one of the sources that was talking about short selling tulips, and I just got the terminology confused. Another one for this episode, the United Provinces did have an aristocracy. We said they didn't. It was just less prominent than in other countries. Yeah, even in the first episode we mentioned like the Prince of Orange and his court. So what we meant to say was that the aristocracy did not have like their hands on the levers of power to the extent that there wasn't like an aristocratic class that was controlling everything in the same way as a lot of other countries in Europe. But yes, they did have an aristocracy. Episode 4, this is such a great patron question by Peanut Tree 5000. Didn't broken tulips go extinct? The disease that made them look that way shortened their life and made them able to produce less bulbs. I would like to know if they're still around. That's partially true. So all of the famous varieties we talked about, like Semper Augustus and Admiral of Admirals, and a lot of them we refer to generally like Admiral Van Eck. If they were called like Admiral Van Eck was the grower that produced it. It wasn't talked about, it's not a famous admiral it was being named after. Or Alexander the Great, they're all extinct. The virus weakened them to the point with successive generations, they just died out. But broken tulips are still around. The mosaic virus, or TBV, tulip breaking virus, still impacts tulips and lilies. And actually at the time they would intentionally spread the virus, not knowing that that's what they were doing, by taking a piece of an infected bulb and grafting it onto a non-infected tulip bulb. So they thought that they were crossbreeding it this way, but actually they were just spreading the virus. For some reason, back in the 17th and 18th centuries, tulips infected with tulip-breaking virus stayed a lot healthier than they do these days. Like today, if a tulip gets a mosaic virus, the stem is very short, the bulb is very small, it looks sickly, it's not aesthetically pleasing. For whatever reason, back then, they still looked fairly normal, except for not having as many offsets, being a little bit weaker, and having these flame-like or spotted patterns. But most, there are broken tulips today, but they're through breeding rather than the virus. There are a couple of very rare varieties that are broken from a virus and still look relatively healthy to this day, but like I said, they're very rare and expensive. You can still pay a lot for a tulip. Onto YouTube questions and comments. The big one here is we had a graph where the numbers were 1636, 1637, and it should have been 1637. At the end of the graph, we put 1636. It's just a simple mistake. I'm so excited about this. Someone said, I never realized that Haarlem in the Netherlands was related to Harlem in New York. Yes, so a lot of place names in New York and street names are related to when it was New Amsterdam. Some of them are anglicized Dutch words or terms. Some of them are just direct translations. So I have a great list of examples. Some anglicized versions of Dutch words are the Bronx, Staten Island, Brooklyn, Yonkers, the Bowery, and of course Nassau. And there are some translations from Dutch to English like Broadway, Wall Street, Long Island, and Coney Island. I think Long Island was like Lang Island. And Coney Island was Dutch for rabbit, and Coney is an older word, English word for rabbit. I really wanted to do a little like short sidebar about this during the episodes, but we never got time to do it. I really like this question because it gets into an interesting process thing of how we make the episodes. How come you changed the Dutch Army uniforms in this series? They're different uniforms in Jewish Pirates #4, Conquest of India Episode 2, and this episode. They all take place at roughly the same time period. Why are they different? So when we do an episode, we find image resources that the artist can look at that are from the time and place that this takes place. So if the image sources for stuff in India is different from things in like the Caribbean, we're going to do two different types of uniforms. The uniforms in this one, the frame is when they're trampling the tulip fields, and that's specifically from a painting called The Tulip Folly, and I have it here. We wanted to directly reference this painting because it's one of the more famous images of the Tulipmania, but this was painted in 1882 by a French artist named Jean-Léon Gérôme, and so it's produced, over 200 years after, and he probably wasn't that familiar with 17th century Dutch military uniforms. But so basically we're calling out this painting specifically. A lot of people were like, Calvinists as anti-capitalists? So there's this book that comes out in 1905 by a German sociologist, Max Weber, called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And this is one of the central books that kind of like ties the idea of Protestantism, but particularly Calvinism, as sort of this hothouse for creating capitalism. It should be said that modern historians, like any book that comes out in 1905, have complicated this picture a little, right? Like capitalism kind of started to pop up in Italy and France well before the northern areas of Germany that Weber talked about in his book. But also, talking about any group of people as monolithic is always going to have some issues with it. And a lot of modern scholars have talked about whether this thesis is even necessarily true about Calvinism. But this, especially for Americans, we kind of have this idea that like the American capitalist model came from these Puritans that settled New England. It's true and not, right? But I think it's really important to remember that like capitalism is a pretty new thing, and even people that you would think would be kind of simpatico with capitalism, like Calvinists, are still kind of having trouble squaring their beliefs, which are very much scripture-based, with this system that is like a little more ruthless. The Bible says things about helping your neighbor and, being charitable, and how does that square with this new capitalist economic model? And, that hasn't totally fit together at this point in time. So I think that's cool. It's one of the reasons I wanted to include it in the series, is it runs against a lot of times what we think about the relationship between Protestantism and capitalism. And actually, we are going to have to do something a little different today because I'm traveling next week. I wanted to shoot most of this with my setup here in Hong Kong, but episode 5, since it's not out yet, I'm going to have to shoot that little bit in the US. So we're going to jump a little bit down the timeline to next week. I'm shooting this week. We're jumping forward to next week, and I'm going to bring you back. It's a little bit of time hopping. I'm going to use my Statler pencil. This is a reproduction 17th century pencil I got in Nuremberg, where Statler is based. It's really cool, actually, but it's going to be a magic wand right now, and I'm just going to transporto. Hey, extra historians, welcome to Extra History Mid-Atlantic Campus. I'm at my house in the US, so I have actually a bunch of collectibles behind here, and I want to talk about that because we didn't really have a lot of actual questions for episode 5, but people were very interested in kind of continuing the discussion that we started in the episode. People want to talk about the Railway Mania and wondered if we'd do an episode on that, maybe. But I really wanted to talk about how what I loved about this series is it made me understand how people spend money more, and how all of us do it. And what it made me realize is that we spend money emotionally most of the time. Just like we eat emotionally frequently. We spend money for a lot of different reasons. Something that is very valuable to me could be just patently ridiculous to spend money on to you, right? Like when I was growing up, my mom didn't want me to do like collectible card games or comics because she kind of considered them disposable. Whereas like when I was in college and just after college, I used to buy like vintage magazine advertisements out of Old Time and Life magazines and frame them as art. And that's a magazine that probably sold for 25 cents in like 1966. And here I am like taking a movie advertisement out of it and buying it for 20 bucks and then spending, probably triple that to frame it. Again, even as I was doing it, I'm like, this is absurd. Like, this is the actual value of this is less than a cent, likely, but I don't know. I wanted that, and I was willing to spend, however many dollars, like 70, 80 bucks to have a cool piece of art, unique piece of art framed on my wall. So I just keep thinking about that. And now that I see that everywhere, that like, oh, this thing is very meaningful to you and you want to spend money on it. Whereas I just, I don't really care. And also like the idea that when you buy something, you also buy access to a community of people who like that thing often, if you're doing a collectible, right? Like if you're into stamps, like, and you have a stamp collection, you go to like the stamp fanciers ball or whatever. But if you buy role-playing books or like gaming miniatures, then you can go to a club and play with other people who like that stuff. And this is basically every hobby in the world is like knitting circles, right? So it's made me change how I look at how people spend money and how I spend money. And I just thought that was very cool. All right, back to Hong Kong, and last week, my daughter took the magic wand out of my suitcase while I was packing. Magic Wordicus. Thanks for that little transition. And let's go to what's coming up on Extra History. The Ethiopian Empire, focusing on the Solomonic dynasty. This was a really hard series to do because it covers 700 years. A lot of it we don't have very good imagery sources for. So we did what I think is a heroic effort to try and like visually design this period or these multiple periods. It's going to be very cool. I also want to call out Ali's art for this series was fantastic. Nick has worked really hard on the next series as well. Then we're doing Eleanor of Aquitaine. This is going to be a 4-episode romp through medieval royal marriage and just crazy family politics. She's the only person to have ever been Queen of France and Queen of England. And of course, she's the mother of Richard the Lionheart, the wife of Henry II. And, her son, Prince John, is trying to steal the throne from his brother all the time. After that, we just got through Easter Rising, Ireland's Day of Reckoning. This is going to be a really cool series about the conditions that lead up to the Irish War of Independence and Irish Civil War. Ibn Battuta's side trip, I wanted to talk about the role the Netherlands played in the American Revolution, which I think is undervalued. So we all know about, like, France is the chief ally of the American colonists in trying to win independence, but there is major support that comes from the Netherlands. John Adams goes to the Netherlands in 1778 to secure a loan, but here's the thing, that loan is private. Officially, the Netherlands is a neutral nation, partially because William V, who's the stadtholder, the chief magistrate, is related to George III, right? Because William V is the Prince of Orange. So there's a little bit of discomfort there, but there are a lot of private individuals who are transporting war material to the nascent United States, and the Netherlands gets in trouble for it. The British start interdicting war material, and they end up grabbing 35 Dutch ships, and the Netherlands starts to join this this group called the First League of Armed Neutrality, which is set up by Catherine the Great in Russia. Russian ships are also going to the U.S. The British find out that they're going to join this group. They get angry. They declare war on the Netherlands, and they fight the Anglo-Dutch War, ending in 1884 after the American Revolution is already over. It actually sends the Dutch Empire into decline. The Dutch East India Company takes a bunch of losses. There's only one really major naval battle, but there's a lot of fighting in the colonies, kind of piecemeal. But, you know, between weapons shipments, loans being extended, and also just, you know, it's the second nation to recognize the United States as independent. It's the first nation in 1776 to fire a cannon salute to the American flag. So there's like a morale boost, as well as all of these very practical pieces of aid. So thank you, Netherlands. That's a very, I think it's an underappreciated contribution to American independence, and they suffered for it a lot more. Well, I don't know if they did suffer for it more than the French. I guess that it depends on how you look at it and how you see the French Revolution. But thanks so much for tuning in. I had such a great time with this series. Please join us next time. See you later.
The most legendary thanks to Ahmed Ziad Turk, Alicia Bramble, Angelo Valenciana, Arcalite Games, Casey Mustia, Dominic Valenciana, Joseph Blame, and Kyle Murgatroyd.